Hello,
Hey,
hello. Thank you
Michael.
so much
Hey,
for
Ashish.
joining us.
We
Hey
weren't trying to
Todd,
freeze you
going on?
out. You're now in the show live on the internet, which is a cool thing. I think that's a pretty cool thing. I never thought I'd be doing that. Michael, Ashish, let's start with some introductions. Who are you? Who do you work for? What do you work for? What do you believe in?
Sure. So hi, I'm Ashish. I'm a product manager in the VPC product management team, and I take care of two services that you may have heard of. One is called AWS Private Link, and the other one's called VPC Lattice.
Okay.
And I'm Michael. Greetings from cold, snowy Germany. I'm a product manager in the AWS serverless organization, focusing on event bridge and step functions.
Fantastic. And quick icebreaker question for both of you. Have either of you been on air before, or is this your first time?
This is actually my first time. How about you,
Same.
Michael?
Same.
Fantastic. Well, we're very excited to have you both here. Let us know, what are you here for, and why should our listeners be interested in what we're about to talk about?
Of course. So I'm here to talk about a new feature that we launched at reInvent that's part of AWS Private Link and VPC Lattice. And this feature is called Cross VPC Resource Access, and it does exactly that. It allows you to access a resource that's sitting in VPC A in account A from a VPC B in account B. So if you're, let's say, sitting in VPC B in account B, you can access a resource, for example, a database, a web server, a cluster, an IP address, or simply a domain name that's in VPC A in account A. So it's cross VPC resource access in a completely private manner.
Mhm.
Fantastic.
Okay, yeah. So I just want to recap for our new to AWS folks who might be tuning in. A VPC is a network boundary that we create in the cloud for security reasons to protect resources from external access. And so you configure a VPC, you can put resources into that VPC, and by default, those things are secure.
Isolated.
But yeah, they're isolated, but there are reasons that you would want an external service to access or another VPC to access resources in one of the virtual private cloud boundary. And so that's what you're talking about here. We can do this sort of access across these VPCs.
Absolutely. So you may have, for example, an RDS database that's sitting in one VPC, and you may have an analytics provider that you may want to expose your database to. With this new feature, you can now essentially share your RDS database with the provider, and they can privately access your database without going over the internet.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Michael, how does serverless come to this? I see this cool AWS serverless tag next to your name. Where do you come in on this? Yeah. What do you know about this?
So yeah, together with Ashish's group, we worked on an integration with this new capability that launched at reInvent, and we made it available in EventBridge and step functions because often our customers and developers using our services have resources like web servers or legacy services inside VPCs or on premises. And before the launch, it wasn't actually easy to connect from your step functions workflow or EventBridge, event-driven architecture into these private networks. And together with Ashish's group, we kind of made it quite easy to integrate with these endpoints and also securely.
And so why is it that these serverless functions, why were these specifically challenging for that cross VPC work?
Yeah, so consider an AWS service like EventBridge, a particular application or service that is owned by AWS and not by a customer. And therefore, we don't automatically have access to these private networks where customers run their applications in, because this is like secure by design, zero trust policy, right? And in order to overcome this network limitation, there's a fundamental network technology that we need. And this is what Ashish worked on and launched.
Okay, very cool. And so I understand that both of you are going to have demos to get to show us. Okay. I have two things to say. The first thing I have to say is, Ken Sherman, I see that you say my mic sounds nice. Thank you so much for that. My second question is, Ashish and Michael, who is going to be showing us first?
I'll be going first, Fiona.
All right, let's hand it off to you, Ashish.
All right. So as you can see on my screen, I have two VPCs. One I've called the resource VPC, and the other I've called the client VPC. Now, essentially, what I have in both of these VPCs are two EC2 instances. Let me go to the EC2 tab. one of these EC2 instances is called a test web server. I'm going to show you that it's residing in the resources VPC, as you can see here.
Yes.
And the other is called the client EC2 instance, or the client, which is inside the client VPC.
Different VPCs.
Different VPCs. Now, for the purposes of this demo, both these VPCs are in my account, but these can just as well be in two different accounts. And now what I'm going to be showing is how you can send queries from the client EC2 instance to a web server that's running in the resources VPC. All right. So as you can guess, there are two parts to the experience. One is the part of the experience where I, as the owner of the web server, am going to share it with a client, and the other part of the experience is when once me as a client have received that web server, or a web server has been shared with me, I'm going to enable connectivity to it from my VPC. So we'll start from the server side of things. All right. So if we come to the VPC console, there is this new section here called Private Link and Lattice, and this is where all the magic happens. All right. So the first thing I need to do is I need to create what is called a resource gateway inside the resource VPC. All right. So I click on resource gateway, and then I click on create resource gateway. Now, essentially what a resource gateway is that it is a point of ingress for traffic to come into the VPC that has the web server. So if I'm sharing a web server with, let's say, other VPCs or other accounts, I need to make sure that my VPC has a resource gateway. So I come to create a resource gateway, I just call it a test gateway. I select the IP address type. In this case, I've chosen IPv4, and then I come to VPC. Now, because my web server is in the resources VPC, I select the resource VPC to create my resource gateway in. I select any two subnets, and then going further down, I select my security groups. Now, security groups help me control what kind of traffic I want to allow inside my VPC, and that's pretty much it. So I select my VPC, I select my security groups, and then I click on Create Resource Gateway. For the purpose of this demo, I already have a gateway created, which is called a test gateway. So now that my VPC that has the web server has a resource gateway, the next step I'm going to do is I'm going to create what is called a resource configuration for my EC2 instance. Now, for that, I come and click on resource configuration, and then I come here and I click on Create Resource Configuration. Now, a resource configuration, you might wonder, is like, what is a resource configuration? So resource configuration very simply is something that represents the resource that you want to share. So in this case, we had the EC2 instance, which was running my web server. Before we can share that EC2 instance with another account or another client, it's important that we create a resource configuration for it. So essentially, you can think of a resource configuration to be a parallel of a resource.
Got it.
So we come here, we create, resource configuration. We call it, let's say, test config, and then we select a configuration type. In this case, because we are only sharing, one EC2 instance, we choose resource, and we don't choose resource groups. If you were sharing, let's say, multiple resources or multiple IP addresses, we could select, resource group.
Okay. I'm just going to cut you off really quickly. Sorry about that. But we do have a comment in the chat from John Doe, who has said he just joined the chat or just joined our Twitch and wants to know what is it that you are demoing. So would you mind just giving a quick background for John Doe?
Of course. Hi, John. So what we're trying to demo here is that we have a web server that's running in VPC A, and we have a client that's running in VPC B, and we're trying to show how you can connect privately from the client to the web server, across two different VPCs in a private manner. The demo that we're showing has the two VPCs in the same account, but this could work just as well between two different accounts as well.
Awesome, because this is a new launch for VPC resource sharing.
Yep.
Awesome.
All right, so we were creating our resource configuration for the web server in order to be able to share it. So we gave it a name. We selected a resource. We chose type single. There are other types as well if you want to share more complex resources, for example, clusters and RDS databases. But in this case, we simply have an EC2 instance that's represented by an IP address. We'll simply choose single. We choose our gateway. Remember, we just created a gateway to allow traffic into the VPC. So we choose our test gateway. And then coming here, we have to actually now define the resource that we want to share. So now you'd remember we were sharing a web server, and the web server has a private IP address, which we will come here and copy. Remember, we have to always specify a private IP address because this is all private connectivity.
Right.
So we copy the private IP address, we come back to the resource configuration creation screen, and we select the resource type as IP resource, and then we paste the IP address that we copied.
Okay.
We can also specify port ranges. In this case, we want to only limit access to port 8080 because it's HTTP traffic. We can do that as well. For now, I'll just leave it as is. And there are a bunch of other settings that are here on the page. You can enable monitoring, tags. One particular thing that I want to talk about is this one called share resource configuration. As I mentioned, if you wanted to share the EC2 instance with another account, here is where you would do that. You would simply share a RAM share that you have in AWS Resource Access Manager, which would allow you to sort of share that IP address or that EC2 instance with another account. And then that's it. You come here and you click on Create Resource Configuration. Again, I already have a resource configuration created, which is called Test Config Web Server. So we did two things. We created a resource gateway in the VPC that had the web server, and we created a resource configuration to represent the web server. That concludes the steps on the provider side. Now we'll move over to the consumer side of things.
Okay.
So now, as a consumer, I want to enable connectivity to this particular web server. So what I can do is I need to first go to service networks. There are actually a bunch of different ways to do it, but I'm going to just be showing one, and if time permits, another way. But the first way is that we create what is called a service network. Now, a service network is a concept in VPC Lattice that essentially you can think of it as a collection of multiple services and resources. So it's like a logical collection. You define it, and then you add multiple resources and services to it, and then you attach this collection to whichever VPC you want to enable access from to those resources and services. So here we'll just come and define a test service network, and we can provide a description if we want. And we'll skip over services because I'm assuming audience already knows about this. The part that we want to talk about is the resource configuration. So remember, we just created a resource configuration called the test config web server that represents a web server. So we'll click on this, and this will add the resource config to our service network. Okay. We'll skip over the rest of the options. You can enable monitoring, sharing.
I just want to make sure we have a chance to get to Michael's part of the demo as well. So we're creating this service network, pretty basic configuration. I'm assuming you've already done that for this demo, so maybe we can jump into what you've set up already.
Yep. So we'll just go to the last step. So we created the service network, and the last step is we want to enable access to that service network from the client VPC. Okay. And so to do that, we'll create an endpoint in the client VPC. An endpoint is essentially a VPC endpoint. So we come here, we click on endpoints, and then we click on create endpoint here. Now, once you come to create endpoint, you have two options. You can either click on resource and create a VPC endpoint directly to the resource, directly to the test config web server, which is here, and then you can specify the client VPC. Or what you can do is you can specify a VPC endpoint of type service network and connect to the test service network that we just created. So both options work fine. And I'll just do that. I select my client VPC, I select my subnets, and once I'm done selecting my subnets, I come down here and I say create endpoint. Again, I already have endpoints created. One is the resource endpoint to directly talk to the resource config, and the other is the service network to talk to the service network that contains the resource config. In each of these cases, what you can do is you have a DNS name that is provisioned for you. So I click on my endpoint, I go to associations, and I go to DNS name, which is here. This is the DNS name that I can use on my client instance to talk directly to the web server.
Okay.
Similarly, for the VPC endpoint of type resource, I can go and click on associations, and I see that I have a resource config associated, which has a DNS name that I can use on my client instance to talk to the web server. I will not go and actually show the connectivity running because we have less time and we have to go over to Michael. But essentially, I can just do a curl on this DNS name to connect to the web server.
Yeah, and like a snowflake, that DNS name is unique. It's gonna create a secure connection. I love it. That's fantastic. Thanks for sharing.
Yeah, and if I just want to say for our audience, if you're like me, who's networking can be really complicated for me. Like I'm just, it takes me an extra step to really, and it was one of the hardest things for me to learn at AWS, but it's really not as scary as it seems. A VPC is just a boundary, security boundary. So you can collect resources and you can secure those things and logically group them together in a secure way. And what we're showing here is making those VPCs talk to each other by configuring a connection point with VPC, a private link between those two things, so it's not exposed anywhere else or not anybody else can use it. So it seems very technical, but once you start to understand the concepts of a VPC, why we use them, how they're used, these things will start to click into place. And so that brings me to Michael. And Michael, my understanding is you use this feature for a launch that you had at reInvent this year as well. So that's what you're gonna. So let's bring your screen up and get into that.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. Exactly. So in Ashish's demo, you basically saw the provider, the resource provider, like the web server, and then also the consumer side, like how to set up the service network and so on. But what if you are, as a consumer, what if you don't own that VPC? For example, because you use step functions, which is a workflow service that's serverless on AWS, and that lets you visually build complex business processes, or even for your home automation projects. Let's say you want to know what the weather is, so you want to grab it from a weather station. You have multiple steps, especially you want to see if it's cold out there and whether you want to go out by car or so. And so typically you have these workflows, multi-step sequences. And step functions allows you to model these workflows. But what if your weather service, the weather station, is in a VPC, in a private VPC that is not publicly accessible? And this is what we launched at reInvent in joint collaboration with Ashish's team, that lets us use this technology, network technology, to securely connect into individual resources that are shared by resource owners across accounts. And this is what I'm going to show you here. So we are part of the consumer experience. Let's just assume someone has shared a private resource like a weather station, a load balancer with us. So I go into step function and I have to find the most simple basic workflow that you can imagine. It's a single step. It's a start, step, and an end. And in step functions, we have a concept. Yeah, very simple, right? To not distract. And in step functions, we have the concept of tasks and an HTTP step, because let's just assume this weather station is an HTTP web server, right? So you can just drag and drop this HTTP step into your workflow. And then in your configuration of this HTTP step, obviously you need to provide an API endpoint where the server runs. So here I have a DNS name, private API example. Again, this is a resource that was or is running in a private VPC. And then I'm just configuring methods, so just plain old basic HTTP stuff. But how do I know, or how do I tell step functions now that it should be using this private link connectivity to securely tunnel into the VPC? And this is where we have the concept of a connection. Connection isn't new if you're familiar with step functions in EventBridge. A connection has already been there because we've used it for authorization, and we are still using it, for example, to say, oh, I have an API key or a basic auth connection that I want to authorize against. But now we enhanced, as part of our launch at reInvent, we enhanced the connection to also allow you to express private connectivity. And you see, I already use a connection here. It's in active status, but let's quickly take a look at this connection. The connection is a resource in EventBridge, so we share this connection resource across services for consistency and also simplicity, so you can use it in your event-driven architectures or in your workflows. And here, as part of the connection overview, we see it's active, so that's in a good state. You have other details, but it also tells you that it is actually private, a private connection against a private API. And if you look closely here, it tells you that it is using a resource configuration. And this is what we saw earlier in Ashish's demo, the resource that you share, this like private DNS name, the weather station, right? Just to show quickly how you can create a connection. Again, nothing really has changed because we had these connections before, except of the new way to express private connectivity. By default, we allow public connectivity. So say you want to send it to Slack or a public endpoint, that has always been possible. But now we have this private toggle, and when you click private in the connection, you just pick the resource configuration that was shared with you. Super easy. Because I've already done this, we can just go back ahead and start our workflow and see if it works, shall we?
Let's do it. Yeah, I love this, right? Because it used to be that we'd have to like expose things that we didn't want to expose, and then we have to manage security using other mechanisms. Where we have to do some token exchange or some sort of private thing. But now we can just sort of cut that out, go straight to the private thing, and know that it's secure because we've done this configuration across our VPCs, which I think is really clever. So you kick this off. You hit our start. We're going to do one big HTTP step and then.
All right. And here we go. So let's scroll down. Just wait a sec.
Step function is so cool. Like you get this graph view. You get to kind of see what's going on. Hey, green looks good. Check mark green.
Green looks good. And just so you believe me, I can go here. It shows all the states, and it shows you, hello, this is a Lambda function behind a private application load balancer. So everything is private, everything is secure, and super nice and super easy.
Nice. So we have a private API behind a VPC, and again, like sometimes when you see this kind of green check mark and everything's good, you miss sort of some of the complexity that has been taken care of for you behind there, establishing that secure connection, making sure that only this resource can do that based on these configurations. But I can see how this is really easier for me now to make these connections and incorporate them into things like step function. So very cool, Michael.
Grab resources from two different places. This is a great way to step up efficiency so you don't have to do all that work behind the scenes.
Yeah, well done, Ashish, Michael. So if our audience, which I imagine there was a lot to cover here, and they wanted to go learn more, dig deeper, take that next step in understanding how this works, what might you suggest they go? I know, Michael, you've got maybe something different from Ashish.
On our side, we have...
Go ahead.
Yeah, just quickly, we have our documentation, obviously. We have a joint launch blog that Jeff Barr wrote, actually. We're happy to have him together on this private link and step functions capability. Yep, Ashish.
Yeah, so this cross VPC resource access is a feature in both AWS Private Link and VPC Lattice. You can visit any of those two documentations to learn more about it, as well as the web pages.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think we will.
Hey, great demo, guys.
Into those resources. Thank you so much for joining us, and we hope to see you again on the show very soon.
Yeah. Thanks for having us, Fiona.